I wanted people who I think are rightly skeptical, if not cynical, about American politics these days to understand that part of the genius of the American system is that in moments like that, people do come in the side door like this. We have a system that is really good at yielding up people from nothing in moments where it's most needed.
That was our guest Troy Senik talking about President Grover Cleveland, one of the more obscure but also more notable men to sit in the Oval Office. I'm Mark Updegrove, President and CEO of the LBJ Foundation.
And I'm Mark Lawrence, Director of the LBJ Presidential Library. And this is With the Bark Off. Grover Cleveland hardly ranks among the most celebrated or accomplished of American presidents. Like Chester A. Arthur, Benjamin Harrison, or other presidents of the late 19th century, Cleveland held office at a time when Congress dominated national political life, and few Americans expected much of their chief executive. And yet closer inspection reveals a most remarkable president, and not only because he is the only one to hold 2 non-consecutive terms.
Troy Senik is a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush and a co-founder of the digital media company Kite Key. He is also the author of A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland.
Troy Senik, thank you so much for joining us on With the Bark Off to talk about your new biography of Grover Cleveland. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's a delight to be here with both of you.
Troy, talk a little bit to get us started about how you came to this project. I think it's fair to say that, like many presidents of the 19th century, Grover Cleveland is pretty obscure in American history. How did you decide to write a book about President Cleveland?
You know, the odd thing about this book, it's a kind of total serendipity story. This is nothing good about my childhood psychology, but I had been interested in Grover Cleveland from a fairly young age, and the only way that I can really explain that is that I grew up in this sort of very rural patch of California, and was a part of California that feels more like Oklahoma than what you would assume California is, and had an interest in history and politics from a young age, but because politics seemed like such a foreign language, I would see politicians on television. I would think, these people don't sound like anybody I know. They went to schools I've never heard of. I was always kind of intrigued by these outsider figures. And as I'm sure we'll talk about later, Grover Cleveland is very much an outsider figure. It comes kind of out of nowhere, like this rocket ship into the politics of the 1880s. So for whatever reason, that stuck in my mind from, I mean, when I say a young age, we're talking 15, 16. And had just incubated there for the better part of 20 years. And the actual inception story of this book is that I happen to have a couple of friends who are literary agents. This is the first book I've ever written. I've never shopped a book before. And I had a just purely personal conversation with them about how their business worked. Mm-hmm. And they explained to me that certain times there are publishers who ask them to look for somebody to write a book that they know they want, but there's no obvious author for. And their example of a particularly absurd version of this was that Simon & Schuster wanted a book on Grover Cleveland. They did not know who they were talking to when they sent this. So it quite literally fell into my lap, and that's where the book came from.
Well, if we know anything about Grover Cleveland at all, it's likely to be that he's an historical anomaly. He's both the 22nd and 24th president, the only non-consecutive president that we've had in our history. And that becomes relevant today, of course, because Donald Trump continues to be a viable presidential candidate after having lost the office in 2020. So he could potentially be not only our 45th president, but 47th president. Troy, did that have anything to do with why either your publisher or you wanted to tackle this book?
No, it actually didn't, because the book was commissioned during Trump's first term, before this was even on the horizon. So if I didn't already have more than my fair share of dumb luck by having this deposited into my lap, I then compounded it by the fact that I got the one news cycle in the last 120 years where Grover Cleveland is kind of topical.
And you may want to buy a lottery ticket, Troy.
So, Troy, as we've said, Grover Cleveland is not George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, but neither really are the other presidents of the late 19th century, right? Chester Arthur, James Garfield, Benjamin Harrison, Rutherford Hayes. All of these characters fade into the background of American history in many ways. What was it about that era that made it hard for a president to stand out?
It's a very good question. I think there are a couple of things at work. I mean, one is that the presidents themselves had a very different conception of the presidency than we do now, than presidents do now. And one of the more painful exercises that I put myself through while I was writing this book was to actually go back and read the inaugural addresses of a lot of presidents from this era, which is excruciating. I mean, they sort of read like annual reports. But one of the things that you will see throughout them is there's this very kind of stagey self-deprecation about how relatively insignificant they are in the calculus of American politics, some of them being really explicit about the fact that they have an obligation to defer to the Congress. And as I say in the book, this era, with all the presidents that you just mentioned, that Grover Cleveland falls into, is sort of similar to the era between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. These are the two great dead zones of American presidential legacies. And there's a couple of things that they have in common. One is that there's very high turnover in the presidency. Between deaths or one-term presidents, you're just cycling through guys really quickly. And the other is, it's funny, I don't think we're always conscious of it, but I think a lot of Americans understand history through the presidency. Most great historical stories in American history, you know the president at the time. That's sort of your lodestar for how the narrative unfolds. And in those two eras, because it's really Congress that's in the driver's seat, when we talk about those eras, we're really talking about issues rather than personalities. So in that window between Jackson and Lincoln, we're talking about the coming of the Civil War and the tension over slavery. And in this era, we're talking about before Cleveland's time, sort of Reconstruction and the aftermath of the war. And as we get to Cleveland and later, we're really talking about economics. We're talking about the Gilded Age and the transformation, the growth of American industry and the relative decline of American agriculture, things like that. So it's just really hard for anybody from that era, any president, to emerge as a kind of celebrity figure. So you will get these decades of presidents that all but the most diehard aficionados of American history just have no concept of.
We go for 36 years, though, with the exception of Grover Cleveland, but before we have another two-term. Let me say, Ulysses S. Grant has 2 terms. I mean, he gets elected to 2 consecutive terms. And he leaves office in 1877, and then we don't get another 2-term presidency until Woodrow Wilson, who holds office from 1913 through 1921. The only 2-term president we have between that time is Grover Cleveland, albeit non-consecutively. Why is that? Is there a political reason that we were cycling through all these presidents?
Well, some of it is, you had presidents who were not a full 2-term presidents during that era, but were more than one, right? Because McKinley was elected twice, but then assassinated early in the second term. Right. TR has the rest of that term plus one of his own. But there was also, it's interesting, I talk a little bit about this as regards Cleveland in the book. There are sort of equal and opposite things happening at the time in terms of the conception of what the proper limits on presidential tenure is. And so what I mean by this is Grant makes a pretty serious run after his 2 terms and after I think 4 years had passed at trying to make a comeback, at trying to run for a 3rd term. By the same token, you've got people like Hayes who aren't that interested in a 2nd term. Cleveland himself actually runs for office saying that it is inappropriate for a president to seek a 2nd term and actually has to do some damage control when he's running for re-election as a result of that. So, today, if you remember when John McCain ran in 2008. There was speculation about, well, maybe he'll only do one term. There's clearly been that speculation around Joe Biden, and we treat that as such an anomaly. It's just a thing that the political insiders really geek out on because it seems so exceptional. But at the time, the conceptions of what were and weren't appropriate in terms of presidential tenure were a little more fluid. This still wasn't quite as closed of a question as it is today.
Well, no matter how obscure Cleveland is, there's no mistaking your very positive assessment of Cleveland. You suggest that he showed greatness. You use the word greatness that, really deserves to be remembered. The title of your book, Man of Iron, I think conveys your very positive assessment as well. Talk a little bit about what it is that you find so admirable about Grover Cleveland.
Well, I should say that one of the reasons that I wrote the book is because the things that I find admirable about him, I also find sort of vexing. It's sort of a double-edged sword. And what I mean by that is, I think the best case that you can make for Grover Cleveland, and I certainly make this in the book, is that he is an extremely unusual figure in the history of the American presidency, which is to say that he does what most of us, I think, would offer off the cuff as our prescription for what we would like presidents to do, which is that he operates almost entirely from first principle. When he thinks something is right, he will do anything for it, regardless of opposition from the other side, regardless of opposition from within his own party. When he thinks something is wrong, he will not give an inch. And I think there is something admirable about this insofar as this is a very, even in the world of the 1880s and 90s, this is an extremely difficult thing for a politician to actually do in practice. There's a reason that this is an ideal for most of us rather than something we've ever witnessed, because it actually tends to not be very good politics. And it comes back to bite Grover Cleveland several times. But I think just the sense of integrity that would allow one to get to this point in their career and act like that is admirable. And as one sees throughout the book, I mean, there are a lot of instances of this that I point out, some of which redound very much to the country's benefit and some of which do not. But I really wanted Americans to reckon with that hard reality, which is the thing that we think of as the ideal outcome in American politics, the kind of person that we might regard as an ideal president. While there is a lot of good that comes with that, it also becomes politically very thorny because politics rewards people who leave a little play in the joints. Politics rewards people who can be a little elastic here and there. And you really see, particularly by the end of his career, this coming back to bite over. I mean, the Democratic Party, he's a Democrat. The Democratic Party has pretty much abandoned him by the end of his second term. So it was that dichotomy was the thing that I found so fascinating here. That these traits that in a vacuum we would regard as deeply admirable can really cut either way.
And Troy, I think
you're of politics.
You're getting at something that you capture in the book by distinguishing between Grover Cleveland as president and the Cleveland presidency.
Yeah, right.
Talk a little bit about that. He was a great president, but maybe had a more indifferent presidency.
Yeah, it's a distinction that I make in the book, which I'm sure sounds semantic when one first encounters it. And I hope I've done a reasonable job as you go through the book of kind of making that distinction. Because I find that greatness in his character. But as you say, I mean, Cleveland's two terms, especially because they are separated by this 4-year gap, are pretty different from each other. The first term is considerably more prosaic. Especially through modern eyes, because when we start talking about the issues that are at play in the first term, vetoes of pensions for Civil War veterans, civil service reforms, they sound unbelievably prosaic to the modern ear. And I try to put them in context in the book, because if you understand, just for instance, I was always confused as a kid in history classes. We get to this era and everybody be fighting over tariffs. And I thought, why in God's name are they spending this much time fighting over tariffs? when you see it in context, you realize that, well, that's where all the federal revenue came from at the time. So it's the equivalent of fighting over income tax rates today, and you can sort of see how it fits in that world. But Cleveland's second term in particular is very volatile. There is a major economic downturn, which we now refer to as the Panic of 1893, but at the time was referred to as the Great Depression. It was the biggest economic downturn the country had seen up to that time. There is this huge party-splitting battle within the Democratic Party over which direction it's going to go in on economic issues. Cleveland representing a more sort of Jeffersonian, classical liberal, limited government perspective. William Jennings Bryan and the ascendant populists cutting in the opposite direction. There's this huge fight that Cleveland inherits as he comes into office over whether the United States is going to annex Hawaii. So he spends his whole second term just kind of trying to hold on in a way that is not consistent with how his first term operated. So if you were to just put out on a spreadsheet the policy issues or the accomplishments, Grover Cleveland would not look like, for instance, Lyndon Baines Johnson, where there's a clear list of accomplishments where you can see, but for this, the country is a very different place afterwards. There are some things like that about Cleveland, but he loses as many of these battles as he wins. And so that's why I think it's entirely fair. I mean, I say in the book, Grover Cleveland does not belong on Mount Rushmore. That is not the argument that I am making. But the way that he conducts himself in office, I think two things. One, does provide a model that could at least provide partial inspiration for American politics at a time where this kind of idealism really seems in steep decline, hard to come by. And the other factor that I think is important, and one of the reasons that I thought this book ended up being good for this moment, is I wanted readers to have a sense. Cleveland has this meteoric rise, and it happens in part because national politics in the aftermath of the Civil War is dominated by the Republican Party. And the Republican Party has what I call in the book the equivalent of political gout. They've had things too good for too long. There's lots of corruption through the system. And Cleveland has this meteoric rise because he is seen as a guy who is above all this, won't put up with Republican corruption or Democratic corruption. Mm-hmm. And the reason I wanted to highlight that is because I wanted people who I think are rightly skeptical, if not cynical, about American politics these days to understand that part of the genius of the American system is that in moments like that, people do come in the side door like this. We have a system that is really good at yielding up people from nothing in moments where it's most needed.
Yeah, let's step back from Cleveland's non-consecutive presidencies for a moment and talk about how he got there, Troy. What stunned me in reading your book is the rapidity with which Cleveland rises through politics. He goes from being the mayor of Buffalo, New York, to being the governor of that state, to being the president in 4 years. How do you explain his rapid rise through politics?
It's really remarkable. That I always tell people the best way to understand Grover Cleveland is to start with him in the year 1881, which is the year that he turns 44 years old. At that point, he is a lawyer in private practice in Buffalo, has been for about 10 years. As I say in the book, well thought of, but not thought of that often, by which I mean he's a somewhat distinguished figure in the community, but he's not a particularly fluorescent personality. He's not a leading man about town. He had one prior elected office, which was as the sheriff of Erie County, New York, where Buffalo is, a job that he sort of got because nobody else really wanted it. Democrats needed somebody on the ticket to help bolster a House candidate. And the sheriff's office in Buffalo, as in a lot of the country at the time, was sort of seen as disreputable. There's a lot of graft that went in and out of sheriff's offices. Cleveland would have none of that when he was there, and was, in fact, famous for the fact that when they would make deliveries of cordwood to the sheriff's office, the kind of arrangement where in most offices a little would, to use the modern parlance, fall off the truck, and there'd be a little bit of a kickback to the sheriff's office. Cleveland would go there and specifically would sort of measure it himself to make sure that they got everything they paid for. And this earns him a measure of public affection. It also sort of marks him as a pain in the ass within the Democratic Party. And for about a decade thereafter, he's in this law practice because he's sort of on the outs. And it's also probably worth mentioning that he doesn't seem deeply ambitious. This is clearly not a man who has organized his entire life around elected office. In fact, I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that he was probably more desirous of something like being a judge. Mm-hmm. But in 1881, there's kind of a repeat of what happened in that sheriff's race, which is his entire quest to the presidency, or journey to the presidency, I should say, starts in a bar in Buffalo when he walks in one night and sees some of the Democratic regulars, who he knows because he's involved in the party, downcast because they can't find anybody to run for mayor. Nobody thinks that the Democrat is going to win. They've been turned down by everybody. It usually goes to some business figure, which Cleveland is not. And once again, the decision kind of comes down to everybody looking around the table and thinking, well, I mean, Grover could probably do it if we're that hard up. And, what happens is he gets elected mayor, and then you see that same sensibility, the resistance to corruption. I mean, he famously comes into office in Buffalo and is vetoing these padded contracts from the city council, wins huge popularity in the press and amongst the citizenry for this. A year later, governor, as you say, 2 years after that, president. And I'm really convinced, because of the reasons I said earlier, that this is so much of this is ignited by the contrast with what the rest of American politics looks like at that moment, right? The pervasive graft, the pervasive corruption. I'm really convinced that if you move him 10 years back in American history or 10 years forward, none of this happens. It is just a guy who happens to hit at exactly the right moment. And this works in addition, getting him to the presidency in 1884, because he was something that Democrats desperately needed on a couple of fronts. One, he was a Northerner, which helped when the Democrats are still sort of warding off the sense that they're the party of the Confederacy. And two, he was a guy that through his rise in New York politics had been proven to get the kind of Republican crossover votes that you would need to get the presidency during that era. So he just catches it at just the right moment.
Troy, let's talk for a minute about Grover Cleveland's ideology, what he stood for. It's tempting to kind of label him as a conservative, given this attachment to this laissez-faire notion of economics and the appropriate place of government in everyday life in America. But is that a word that makes sense for a 19th century figure like Grover Cleveland?
I don't think so. I'm really glad that you asked this question, because this was the thing that I wrestled with in writing the book. There are a lot of conservatives even to this day who are fond of him, even more libertarians, because you can make a plausible argument that this is a much more libertarian president than most. I think that's fair. But as you suggest, I think there is a danger in reverse engineering our modern ideological terms to this era. And I don't think it's how Grover Cleveland would have conceived of himself. So maybe it's most helpful to start with the similarities to what we now think of as a conservative ideology, because there are a lot of them. As you say, this is a guy who is laissez-faire on economics. He is very aggressive throughout his career about the idea that ascent taken from the taxpayers beyond what is necessary for the core functions of government is, he says, tantamount to theft. He is a guy who is in favor of reducing tariffs, although interestingly, kind of the opposite of how we think of this today, in that he thought that tariff reductions were the populist position. He thought tariffs were actually a tool of corporate corruption, because whoever has the ear of the right senator gets the tariff that they want. He was very much an anti-imperialist and a non-interventionist in foreign policy. This really comes up in the second term when he is resisting the American attempts to annex Hawaii, where he thinks we have essentially been illegally a party to a coup under his predecessor, Benjamin Harrison. And he has a strict and narrow interpretation of the Constitution. There are a lot of things here where you can say, well, seems if not conservative, at least conservative adjacent. But then when you sort of read through him more carefully, you see that there are a lot of things that don't quite match up with that, which is to say, this is a guy who is very concerned about income inequality in a way that a modern conservative would not be. Now, there's an asterisk there because the way he conceives of it is kind of libertarianish insofar as he thinks most of these problems come from the government being too involved in the economy. But he does fixate on the core issue of income inequality. And he also has, though this has not been his reputation, somewhat unfairly, he has a pretty positive view on the labor movement. He doesn't like the more disruptive versions of it when there's social strife coming out of the labor movement, but he does have a lot of sympathy for the working class and for labor, even though it doesn't express itself in a way that it would from Democrats of only 20 or 30 years later. But he does think that it's an important constituency in American life. So, yeah, I mean, there are definitely things that modern conservatives could take from him and find some sort of fellow feeling in. But I just think it is way too much of an oversimplification to imagine him, grafting perfectly onto modern politics of that kind.
This is an era in our country when machine politics, patronage, and other practices that might strike us as in the 20th century as deeply corrupt were pervasive. Yeah. So you alluded to this before, Troy, but how does such an honest person, someone with such manifest integrity, thrive in such a corrupt era?
Well, it's interesting. Part of it is the dynamic that I explained earlier, in that he just happens to be sort of what the electorate wants at that moment as a rebuke to that kind of politics. But there's a couple other things going on too, right? It's never just dumb luck. There are a couple other things happening. One is that it's actually a very important data point that he moves up as quickly as he does, by which I mean he's only mayor of Buffalo for a year. So he torches a lot of people within his own party, including these sort of special interests, but he gets out before the bill comes due. He's already on to the next office. Same thing basically happens in his time as governor of New York, and that is why you really only start to see him suffer the consequences of moving against the political machines like Tammany Hall and stuff when he's president, because he's got nowhere else to go. So it does really matter the length of the game you're playing, right? Because if you can get out before the consequences arrive, it looks very different than if you can't. And the other factor is he was just the beneficiary. This is particularly true in his run for governor of New York. He was just the beneficiary of the fact that the political machines and some of the other factions within the Democratic Party, none of them, for his nomination fight in particular, none of them had enough of a controlling majority in that process to be dispositive, and Cleveland sort of slides through as everybody's second choice. And that he is always kind of working around the system in ways that seem improbable, in ways that are improbable. I mean, there's, if somebody had done this and failed, we wouldn't be writing a book about them. So he just happens to be the one exception. But he gets very lucky, but some of the luck is, if not by design, hard to tell, because he never tells us what he's thinking. He's not an introspective person. We don't have in his own hand what the strategy was here. But whether it's because it was who he really was, or it was because just where the country was at that moment, he just sort of caught the lightning in a bottle.
Troy, in the 20th century, we are used to presidents who want to call attention to themselves through action, right? None more so, it seems to me, than Lyndon Johnson. But as you point out in your book, we might well know more about Grover Cleveland if he had seized his best opportunities for a big place in American history. And especially, I think you make this point in connection with foreign policy. Cleveland might have presided over the annexation of Hawaii or even Cuba, yet he let those opportunities pass. So why did he turn down these chances, maybe to remembered as a seminal figure in American history?
Yeah, when you look at the career of Grover Cleveland, one thing that is very clear is that this was not a guy who was working on legacy in the way that we would conceive of that now. He had such a modest conception of the presidency. Not necessarily a consistent one, by the way, because in his second term, you do see a slightly more vigorous use of executive power, I think because he had been burned by how passive he had been in the first term. But to some of the examples that you point out, I mean, again, this is why I say there's I think a real virtue in Cleveland, even in cases where it hurt him politically. It was more important to him that he do the right thing. So he was deeply offended. One of the only sort of lengthy quotations from him I reprint in the book is his message to Congress over his opposition to the annexation of Hawaii, because this is a man, when you read this, who is in real pain. He feels as if he has misunderstood the character of the country if the United States is willing to co-sign on one of its diplomatic representatives being party to the overthrow of the monarchy of a foreign country, and to have them have their entire form of government, their entire local cultural sensibility be overthrown in the name of American expansion. He's just mortified by this, morally repulsed by it. So there, it really comes down to he thought it was wrong. He didn't want any glory that was attached with it. He thought it was wrong, and that's what you sort of consistently see here. But you're quite right. I mean, if you just reverse the scenario of 4 or 5 things in Grover Cleveland's presidency, we could say, this is the man who got Hawaii in the hands of the United States. This is the man who got Cuba in the hands of the United States. One that would have come at very little cost was when he came into office during his first term, he had inherited a treaty which would have allowed us to build what was essentially the Panama Canal before the Panama Canal was built. He turns it down because he has this very strict sense of America's role in the world. And the terms of this treaty are such that Nicaragua is going to become an American protectorate. He just doesn't think that that is consistent with what American foreign policy should look like. So because he is defining his presidential duty so much in the sense of being a fiduciary, so much in the sense of just making sure everything runs well, making sure that Congress doesn't overstep its boundaries. In the foreign policy context, making sure that the country doesn't overstep its boundaries. He is just not really psychologically calibrated for that quick 4 or 5, 6 item list that you can look at and say, well, that's a great presidency. And there's some virtue in that and some real political cost in that.
One of the revelations in this book for me, Troy, was Cleveland's cancer diagnosis in the middle of his presidency. And what is perhaps remarkable is, number one, how that cancer is treated, and number two, that it was kept secret from the American public. Talk about that incredible story in Cleveland's presidency. It
is a remarkable story, and I will do something unusual for somebody who is promoting a book and recommend to people another book on this. There's a book entirely on this surgery called "The President is a Sick Man," and it's terrific. And my chapter is very much indebted to that book. Mine has more of the political context, but yeah, Cleveland early in his second term. This is in 1893. This is at the same time that the economy is collapsing, which is an important detail. A tumor is found on the roof of Cleveland's mouth, and the decision is made that A, he has to have surgery, and B, it has to be kept from the public. And part of the reason it has to be kept from the public, without going into any detail about the monetary policy of the 1890s, the panic of 1893 really hinges on the money supply and arguments over gold versus silver. Suffice it to say that Cleveland and his vice president are on totally different sides of this issue. So if the president's health is imagined to be imperiled, you are only going to spook the markets more. So this incredibly clandestine, surreptitious plan is developed in which Cleveland is ferried up to New York City. Cleveland has a vacation home in Cape Cod. And the official story is he is going to be taken by boat up to his vacation home. This would have been common. I mean, at the time, Washington in the summer, you actually didn't expect to see the president and the Congress. They were out of town. This is a plot that could only be pulled off in the sort of pre-mass media era. And he is given this surgery on board a sailboat in Long Island Sound. A pretty graphic, invasive procedure in which part of his jaw is removed. It's drilled up into the roof of his mouth. And in fact, it turns out that when he comes out from under surgery, he has essentially lost the ability to speak in any recognizable fashion because the procedure has been so invasive. The only reason the public never learns about this is that a dentist creates a prosthesis for him, which he wears for the rest of his life, and sort of restores something like his normal speaking voice. This does leak to the press eventually, and what is so remarkable about this, I knew the story before writing the book in some detail, and I knew, as one would from reading Matthew Algeo's book, President is a Sick Man, that one reporter had gotten this story, and had gotten it substantially right, and that it was batted down by Democrats in the press as just calamity howling, as they would say, a manufactured story. What is remarkable about this is that the press corps at the time in Massachusetts, where Cleveland's home was located, they had real questions. And in reading through the details of this, I found that the sentiment amongst the press corps was about 50-50. About 50% of them believed the cover story, which was just the president just been having some dental work. And about 50% of them did not. And the remarkable thing was, they did business essentially as a cartel. The policy of the journalists was they would all have to come together and make a collective decision about how they were going to cover the story. And they all agreed to take the White House's side in it. And so the journalist who got it right, actually, was not vindicated until years later, until after Cleveland had died, and one of the doctors involved went public with it, with the permission of Grover Cleveland's widow. But it is a remarkable story that one cannot imagine ever, even if it was attempted, ever going off in today's media environment.
Truly an amazing story. Hey, on a different subject, Troy, it seems to me one of the biggest challenges for a historian is knowing how to evaluate historical figures who hold ideas about any number of subjects, but gender and race certainly among them, that may strike us as, hopelessly outdated or even just downright offensive. Let's talk a little bit about how you treated Cleveland with respect to the women in his world and also with respect to the issue of race. First to women.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this because these are both fraught issues where Grover Cleveland is concerned, but both fraught in kind of unusual ways, right? So the issue of women in Cleveland's life, there's kind of there's a fork in this road. There are the stories of the women he was personally involved with, and then his broader views on women in politics, both of which are kind of interesting. In terms of the women that he was involved with, I spent some real time in the book on two of the things that are probably most widely known or suspected, to the extent that anything's widely known about Grover Cleveland. One of which is that during the 1884 campaign, he was accused of having fathered a child out of wedlock. He's still a bachelor at this point. He's never been married. And in subsequent years, this story has been, in recent years, I should say, this is really a product of the last 10 years, this has been inflated into the idea that Grover Cleveland had actually raped this woman. Item one. Item two, which probably even more people are familiar with, is the idea that Cleveland was actually married in the White House and was married to a 21-year-old woman who was at a point when he's in his late 40s, who was the daughter of his deceased best friend and former law partner. Both stories that even the most charitable accounting of would probably regard as icky by today's standards. So I approached both of them really just trying to figure out what had been passed down in a game of telephone and what the historical record actually said. This is the problem when you get into even American presidents who have relatively modest scholarship around them. Who knows? And what I found in both of these cases is that neither one of these incidents can be entirely or even really partially sanitized, but they have been significantly overstated. By which I mean that the child born out of wedlock does, best I can tell, does seem to have happened. It's very clear that Cleveland had a relationship with this woman, and he didn't deny it at the time, although associates of his tried to spread the rumor that actually there had been multiple men involved with this woman, and maybe he was actually doing the the noble thing by standing up for some married friend strikes me as implausible. I can't say impossible, but the subsequent allegations of the rape, which, as I say, it was only really publicized by a book that came out about a decade ago, which I always thought was strange. One would think that unless it had been deeply hidden, we would have known about that in the past. And there's a reason for this, which is that that book seems to rely on pretty solid evidence, which is that the woman in question actually gave an affidavit to the press in which she said this, in which she said that she had been raped by Grover Cleveland. The problem was, and this book excluded that she subsequently gave a statement to the press within just a couple of days saying that she had actually never read that affidavit, that it had been presented to her as if it was a defense of Grover Cleveland that she was supposed to sign, and she publicly disowned it. So makes more sense. This happened before the 1884 election was conducted. One would think that rape allegations a few days before an election in 1884 would probably be disqualifying. To Frances Folsom, his wife, the thing that I found here, again, a little different than the way you normally hear the story, you will often hear this shorthanded as she was his childhood ward, which is creepy. You know, the clear implication is that he's been grooming this woman all along, particularly when you pair it with the illegitimate child story. And again, as I say, there's no version of this story where this all goes away, but it's a little bit more complicated than people think, insofar as, she was a kind of legal ward, but people imagine that he raised her, and that's not true. When her father died, he was essentially more or less kind of an executor of the estate. Frances Folsom and her mother lived in Minnesota for a lot of this time while Cleveland was in New York. They didn't really actually have much contact during her childhood. So he's still marrying a much younger woman, but he is not the one who raised her or anything like that. And just to actually get to the sort of broader question that I think you're asking there, it is interesting. I mean, Cleveland doesn't do a lot of writing in his post-presidency, but one of the few things he writes about is his opposition to women's suffrage. Mm-hmm. And you read the passage that I quote in the book in which he uses religion to punt on this question. He says, well, a higher intelligence than ours has answered this question, so there's no reason for us to relitigate it. And I do not attempt to defend that in the book because I don't ever really feel an obligation to defend Grover Cleveland. I'm just trying to explain his time. And in trying to put his time in context, I do note here that another person who held that position was his wife, who ended up being the president of the New Jersey Association of Women Opposed to Suffrage. So it's just, that's what I try to do on those kind of topics. I don't try to tarry on them. I don't try to ignore them. But I try to frame them in a way where a reader who's coming to them cold has as much of a sense of how they would have looked to the people at the time.
So how do you characterize his view on race in the context of those times, Troy?
It's very complicated. And I don't say that as a pun. I say that because it falls into a category that I don't know that we have any sort of context for now. But this is what I mean by that. Grover Cleveland, particularly by the standards of a Democrat in the late 19th century, has pretty, I mean, we have to judge this, we're grading on a curve, right? But has pretty enlightened views on race, insofar as it's very clear when you read him on any number of topics that he is not a bigot. Grover Cleveland invites Frederick Douglass, who was a Republican in an interracial marriage, to the White House over and over again during his tenure. And Douglass writes in one of his autobiographies that he developed a deep respect for Cleveland on this basis because his fellow Democrats hated this and complained about it endlessly. That said, he's clearly not a racial egalitarian. You can see in lots of language from him as regards Native Americans in the West, as regards African Americans, newly freed African Americans in the South, he does not think of these populations as on equal terms with the white population. And he has and I mean this in both a positive and a negative way, he has a paternalistic sensibility about them, by which I mean he is genuinely concerned with their welfare. And he is also defining their welfare in terms of how closely they can be assimilated to standard white American culture. And that's sort of a through line that you see with him. And it leads to some odd scenarios. Like Cleveland is quite friendly with Booker T. Washington and helps raise money for Booker T. Washington's efforts. And then you can turn around and see, I quote this in the book, him writing about being uncomfortable with the idea of publicly appearing at an event with Booker T. Washington. Now, we can presume from the Frederick Douglass interactions that it's not because the idea of being next to a black man is offensive to him, but clearly he thinks that maybe putting his official imprimatur next to Washington in public. So you can see him sort of threading these needles in ways that are inconsistent. He would have, for a Democrat at the time, been considered fairly advanced on these questions, but he certainly does not pass any modern tests on these questions.
Troy, looking back across both terms, what do you think stand out as Grover Cleveland's most important accomplishments as president?
Well, Grover Cleveland would probably find this fitting because he had such a narrow conception of the office. But I actually think one of the things he does not get enough credit for is the thing that was his political undoing, which was trying to hold the line in his second term during the economic crisis, because it is quite likely the case that if the Silverite Democrats that he was resisting, the people who wanted to expand the money supply with silver as a way to inflate away the debts of a lot of Democratic constituents in the South and the West, if they had gotten their way and Grover Cleveland had not stood athwart them, I don't know what the future of the country would have looked like economically. It's entirely possible that the system could have spiraled into a totally different direction. And by the way, I don't say this to entirely dismiss them, because the Silverites were right to a degree, insofar as relying just on gold at the time was actually mildly deflationary and was hurting those people out on the frontier. But the fact that Cleveland, sort of like Samson with the pillars, was holding it together just long enough for the McKinley to come in and the country to sort of straighten out its ship, I actually think that's a legacy that Cleveland would be proud of. It's a fundamentally little c conservative. He kept there from being this sort of radical upending of the way that the American economy operated. I think he deserves real credit for that. And the other one that this is playing off the same dichotomy we've talked about. If you want to just measure in terms of accomplishments, it's that. If you want to measure in terms of moral value, I do think it's the Hawaii question. He did not, in the end, he did nothing really in terms of the real world effects apart from pushing this off a couple of years, because McKinley comes into office, and in 1898, I believe, in the context of the Spanish-American War, you could make a totally plausible case. This is this outpost in the Pacific. We need it for strategic reasons. And Cleveland still remained, at the time when that happened, deeply offended by America's role in it. But I really do think that it is one of the most supremely morally admirable moments of his presidency, the way that he handles that, because he chooses the path of most resistance, right? It would have been very easy if you were Cleveland to say, I don't like the way that any of this went down. But it's kind of a fait accompli. It's sort of been handed to us. It's not the worst thing in the world to have this outpost in the Pacific. One could imagine a lot of, frankly, better politicians than Grover Cleveland talking themselves into making this work. And he just regards the principle at work here as the principle of self-determination. And he can't imagine an American president coming down on the other side of it. And I think that's deeply admirable.
So what can we learn from Grover Cleveland, who left office over 125 years ago, that would apply to today's America?
Well, I'll give you two radically different answers to that question, because one's a structural answer and one's a personal answer. You mentioned at the top Cleveland's new relevance because of Donald Trump. And I actually wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago about this. So one thing that we can learn is how much difference the institutions we have to pick presidents matter. Because my argument in comparing what Grover Cleveland did to what Donald Trump is trying to do is that for Donald Trump to replicate what Grover Cleveland accomplished, Donald Trump would have to behave in precisely the opposite fashion. And what I mean by that is Grover Cleveland pulls off this return to office in an era before presidential primaries. And he runs for a second term, a third time, running against the base of his own party, who wants this expansion of silver. But he gets the nomination because those are not the people who determine the nomination. And the people who determine the nomination, the party insiders say, well, we don't always like this guy, but he also seems like the adult who's not going to blow up the American economy for giggles, right? But this is the opposite, of course, of how you do this today. In an era of presidential primaries, you want to get back in, you play straight to the base. So that matters, right? The way we calibrate our institutions determines to a degree what kinds of people we get in the White House. And then the personal thing I'd say, I quote this from Cleveland late in the book. There is a moment, I've said it a lot here throughout this episode, that, in a lot of ways, his greatest traits are also political shortcomings. But we shouldn't lose sight of the other side of that, by which I mean Cleveland is told late in his life about a politician. A friend of his makes a remark about a politician that he doesn't really care for. And Cleveland says, the problem with that kind of fellow is that he doesn't understand that there can be power in a moral idea. Cleveland didn't, he says, I think it may be in the same conversation, there's all this talk about playing politics. I never did it, and look where I got. There is something to that you can be too cute about this stuff, that actually doing the right thing or doing a thing in the right way is its own kind of good politics. Not always, and not in every set of circumstances, but there is something about that I think is fundamentally American and sort of fundamental to the American system, and that politicians can really lose sight of sometimes because it all becomes so tactical. And that is really, I think, emblematic of the part of him that I refer to as greatness, that sort of central insight, that these moral things do matter. Character does matter in the people you elect. It may not be dispositive, it may not control everything, but without it, you've got problems.
Our guest has been Troy Senik, and his book is A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland. Troy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, fellas. It's been a pleasure.
My thanks to our sponsors, the Moody Foundation and St. David's Healthcare, and as always, to you for joining us. If you've enjoyed this episode, subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Mark Lawrence. See you next time.